Hello, welcome to this lecture on the Second Dispersal. This presentation is part of the course Introduction to the English-Speaking World of the Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences. My name is Ahmet Çakyoglu. The English language spread across the world in two distinct ways. The first spread, the first dispersal, occurred when large groups of English-speaking migrants left the United Kingdom to pursue new life in regions like North America, New Zealand, and Australia. The second spread, or the second dispersal, happened because of the mass colonization of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean by the British Empire. The term British Empire refers to a worldwide system of dependencies, which can consist of colonies, protectorates, and other territories, that over a span of some 3 centuries was brought under the sovereignty of the Crown of Great Britain and the administration of the British government. Now, this definition may be short and easy to understand, but the British Empire, of course, is a very controversial topic. Long after the collapse of the British Empire, many former colonies, like Iran, called its former presence there evil. And the former South African president, Thabo Mbeki, famously accused the British of doing terrible things wherever they went. Of course, it's easy to agree with these statements, as the British Empire left behind terrible traditions, or you could call them legacies, of unequal and unfair power relationships. They left behind slavery, the terrible invention of concentration camps, and racism. You remember the previous lessons in which we talked about this empire, of course. Now, here you can see a map that shows the British Empire at its greatest extent in 1921. At the height of the British colonial power, the British Empire spanned over 13 million square miles, which is almost a quarter of the Earth's surface. As you can see here, the British Empire was the greatest empire the world has ever known by landmass, so it reached over 36.6 million kilometers squared. But it was also the greatest empire by population. And they ruled over 500 million people, which is more than a fifth of the world's population. At the time, the British Empire included land on every continent. It drew a continuous line of colonies from Cairo to Cape Town. It stretched over lands which today are some of the largest, wealthiest, most populous, and most powerful countries in the world. USA, Canada, South Africa, India, and of course Australia. Now in these next slides, I will show you some photos just to give you an idea of some of the places that were part or are still part of the British Empire. Now, I know you cannot actually read what is on this list, but just think that this is only a short list of places that were at one time part of that British Empire. Of course, the real list is even longer than this. But here you can see among a lot of other places, India, Pakistan, Canada, Belize, Fiji, Kenya, and Nigeria. Of course, we should not forget about the inaccessible island, Tristan da Cunha, here pretty much isolated, as you can see, in the middle of vast amounts of water, 3,350 kilometers off the coast of Rio de Janeiro, 2,400 kilometers off the island of St. Helena, and then 2,800 kilometers removed from Cape Town. Britain's territories included the Americas, the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, and some surrounding islands, Africa, Asia, and Antarctica. These vast territories stretched over all the time zones of the world, which of course resulted in the phrase, "the sun never set on the British Empire," because wherever you went, the sun would always shine. There were many reasons the British decided to colonize so many territories. Firstly, they were envious of the great wealth, which included gold, and power of the other European powers, such as Spain and France, because they were gaining with their new territories. Now, secondly, they had economic reasons. They wanted to expand their trade, which included exotic items that were very sought after in England, and they wanted to expand their agricultural activities in these colonies, which were very profitable. Thirdly, the empire needed slaves to serve its endless expanding need for labor. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they were motivated by what they called the white man's burden. This entailed that the superior white British colonizers, as they would see themselves, had their responsibility to bring European knowledge of science and the Christian religion to inferior races, as they would say, of the world as a means to civilize them. So there you would have the saying, if you could not civilize them, if they were not considered human, like the Aboriginals in Australia and the Bushmen in South Africa, they were considered a problem and attempts were made to wipe them out. The British Empire's negative ideas about race, or their imperialistic ideologies, changed the way that these so-called inferior people were seen by the world, but it also changed the way the colonized people saw themselves. Now this poem here is called The White Man's Burden, which is written by Rudyard Kipling. It says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child. Take up the white man's burden, impatience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain." Now, if you look closely to what the definition is of this poem, it is, of course, the task believed by white colonizers to be incumbent upon them of imposing Western civilization on the black inhabitants of European colonies. Okay, in the next slides, we are going to look into the British colonization of Africa. The scramble for Africa is a term which refers to the rapid division and colonization of the African continent, which largely took place between the years 1880 and 1913, as you can see here. By the beginning of the First World War, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. Now, while it began with the increasing ability of Europeans to explore the interior of the continent, the true starting point was the Berlin Conference, in which the various European powers sat at a table and they agreed to play nice with each other while colonizing. Now, having ensured that no one would be shot over the question of who got what in Africa, of course, the persons not getting shot would be the white Europeans, they proceeded to occupy and rule their assigned bits of the continent. This period is also notable for further entrenching racism in European societies through the use of racialist pseudoscience and philosophy, as the colonial powers in the age of rising liberalism felt the need to justify their subjugation of the native Africans. Some of these so-called gifts and legacies from the colonists are, of course, the English language, a liberal system of education, British sports like cricket and rugby, and, as we can read in the novel Things Fall Apart, religion, which in this case is Christianity. Now let's look at the word pigeon. The definition of pigeon is important. In linguistics, a pigeon is a simplified form of speech created and used as a means of communication by people who have no other language in common. It is nobody's mother tongue and is very limited in what it can convey. So let's see if we can learn pigeon. If you look at these words, try and make out what their definition is, and I'll give you a few seconds before I give you the answer. So look at the first word now. Now this word actually is mustache. So with that knowledge, go to the second word. So the second word actually means hair, or the hair that you have on top of your head. So the link you should see between word 1 and word 2 is the word grass, which actually means hair. In this case, of course, hair that belongs to the head. Now look at the third word. This is hair that belongs to the face, and hair that belongs to the face is otherwise known as a beard. Now, if you look at the fourth word, you can probably make out something like grass on top of the eye, which of course is your eyebrow. And of course, now we have to look at the word Creole. And a Creole is a pidgin language which has developed into the mother tongue of a region. An example of a Creole language is Creole, which is spoken in Sierra Leone. It is still used as a lingua franca, and it is estimated to be known to more than 95% of the population, proving it to be a popular mode of communication. Now, for the next part, we're going to focus on South Africa for now. Here, of course, if you look at this image, you can recognize the Dutch influences in the language under the English sentence. Don't even think about throwing rocks into the valley below. And then Afrikaans, it says, Moenie eers daaraan dink om rotse in die kloof af te gooien nie. And of course, this is because of a very simple reason. South Africa's colonization by the British can be viewed in three stages. So in the first stage of settlement, South Africa was initially colonized by the Dutch in the mid-17th century. And it was only in 1795 that official contact with the English language was made, with the subsequent formation of an official colony, the Cape Colony, in 1806. And then we get to the second wave of settlement, which took place in Natal between 1840 and the 1850s. Upper middle class settlers along with aristocrats arrived, and they were soon followed by settlers who were promised large tracts of land to cultivate and grow sugarcane, which was of course a precious and profitable commodity at the time. And then we get the third wave of colonization or immigration. And this happened because gold and diamonds were discovered in the regions of Kimberley and Johannesburg in the last part of the 19th century. The third wave of settlement caused a massive influx of white settlers. Most of them were British. But settlers from other parts of Europe were also drawn to the riches these regions promised. English was used as unifying language for all these cultures to communicate and trade. South Africa is perhaps most well known for the political system of apartheid. The term essentially refers to the separation of the white community and the communities of color along social, political, and educational lines. So a few examples would include that interracial relationships were illegal, so white and black people were not allowed to get married. Black South Africans could only be in certain areas of the country. So it was common to see signposts that read whites only. And students of color were given a lesser education than their white counterparts. And then that lower form of education was called Bantu education. Because the creator, Hendrik Verwoerd, also known as the architect of apartheid, thought that Africans were only capable of minor education and they were mainly educated to be a labor force. Now, of course, the key figure in this history is Nelson Mandela. In 1961, he was arrested for treason, and although acquitted, he was arrested again a year later in 1962 for supposedly illegally leaving the country. Convicted and sentenced to 5 years at Robben Island Prison, he was put on trial again in 1964 on charges of sabotage. In June 1964, he was convicted along with several other ANC leaders, and he was sentenced to a life in prison. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became South African president and set about dismantling apartheid. De Klerk lifted the ban on the ANC, suspended executions, and in February 1990, he ordered the release of Nelson Mandela. Apartheid finally ended in 1994. Just to put things in perspective, I don't consider myself to be that old. I was born in '82, and I was 12 at the time that apartheid was dismantled, which is insane if you think about it. But in 1994, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of the country. We can learn a lot from Nelson Mandela's words. Even after 27 years of imprisonment, he never lost his focus. He always aimed to stand for his rights and beliefs and the people. And he said, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. And you can look up a lot of quotes from Nelson Mandela, and all of them are more inspiring than the other. Much like Africa, there was a fierce scramble for Asian territories. In the beginning of the 17th century, the British landed in India with the East India Company. This group consisted of merchants and traders in London, who of course with the permission of Queen Elizabeth I, gained a trade monopoly in the region. The East Indian Company started their colonization process in 1612 by establishing trade factories in these territories. Now these territories collectively came to be known as British India, and it consists of what is now known today as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Nepal, Bhutan, and much later Afghanistan. So when India gained its independence in 1947, it was divided into two countries, India and Pakistan. During the reign of the British Empire, English was used to a large degree as the official language of education and administration, which of course you can find back in Kachru circles. Currently, South Asia, also called the Indian subcontinent, ranks as the region that has the third most English speakers in the world. The reason English still has such a profound hold over this region is because it spread quite easily to the native population. And there are three reasons why this happened. Firstly, there was a presence of English missionaries. Secondly, the use of English was a sign of prestige, and the local people realized that to advance in society, they had to speak the language. And finally, the Indian government made English the main language of education in these regions. Now, India was officially under English rule from 1765 up until 1947. During India's occupation, it stood at the center of the British Empire. India's main export included tea, cotton, and later the illegal opium trade. It was considered one of the most important colonies as the British's hold on India allowed the English to control the whole of the Indian Ocean region. So India was occupied by the English for so long, they have suffered what can be called a linguistic identity crisis. Questions regarding whether English should be taught in schools instead of the local languages, whether authors should write in standard English to reach a larger audience or in a regional dialect of English, or whether they should write English at all. These topics are still fiercely debated to this day. Now, we've almost reached the end of this lecture, so make sure you go over the list of key terms for this chapter and check the ones we did not discuss in this lecture. If you have any questions, make sure you bring them to the next lesson. And also make sure that you read the chapter in the course book, An Introduction to the English-Speaking World on the Second Dispersal. And especially focus on the last paragraph about post-colonial theory, which we did not discuss in this lecture. After having finished the novel Things Fall Apart, think of how that novel is part of post-colonial literature, especially in regards to the paragraph on post-colonial theory. Bring your findings to class to discuss them with your teacher and your classmates. That was the lecture on the Second Dispersal and the origins of the British Empire. Make sure you read the works and answer the questions in the course book or, of course, on Moodle. Thank you.